Hey everyone, how have you all been? I'm so excited to show you guys this painting that I did. I dealt with a few disappointments for me to get here, but I'm so ready to share this one with you now. First, I wanted to thank Solar on Instagram for inspiring the painting altogether and getting me out of my very short-lived art block. We will be painting her today. Her posts are so artistic and beautiful. The links to her Instagram will be in the description. So, some of you outside of my patrons may not know this, but I've been dealing with a lot of disappointments with my gouache paintings lately. So, it's really safe to say that I have fallen out of love with gouache, which is something that I didn't think would happen. And after a lot of frustration and wallowing in my own self pity, I finally decided to address this by taking some online classes, and that is where the sponsor of today's video comes in, Skillshare. Skillshare is one of the biggest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes on film, illustration, animation, design, and productivity. Some of my favorite art YouTubers like Arlisha, who does gouache and watercolor portraits, Cho, who does a lot of urban watercolor sketches, and one of my favorites, Jane Betta, who teaches classes on watercolors. These are the people that I learned to paint from, and I think it's so cool to be able to learn more from them. I will also be teaching my own short Skillshare class. It'll be focused mostly on layering with watercolors to create depth with our portraits. It will be in real time and it will all be guided instructions. It's all just going to be a lot of fun watercolor practice, so I will be seeing you guys there. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, which already includes access to my new class, so make sure you check that out. So I took a couple of Skillshare classes. One is a gouache landscape class by Bianca Rayala, and the other one is a watercolor portrait class by the one and only Jane Betta. And I will tell you why I chose these two classes together. But for now, we're gonna focus on the process that I did for the actual painting. So my approach to this was a mix of watercolor techniques and gouache techniques. I really wanted to show the fluidity of watercolors and also the stability of gouache in one painting. I think when I was starting with gouache, I was more willing to experiment with it, and the more I painted with it, the more I set ground rules for it. So I think that's why I really like how this one went. And the beauty of this process really starts with the underpainting that I did. And it's this beautiful pale patina from my Holbein set. And it's such a gorgeous color by itself, but I also think that it will complement the colors that I set aside for her skin tones, because a lot of the regret that I got from my last painting was really not letting the underpainting shine enough. And I have my patrons to thank for pointing this out, because as soon as they said it, I learned that a lot of the personality in the colors really got buried under the very thick layers of gouache that I put on top of it. And so for this one, I wanted to learn from my mistakes, and so the underpainting is a very punchy color, and I want to let it shine through and also set the tone for where I wanted to go for this painting. So once the background is down on my paper, I layered in a very thin wash of my burnt sienna, and it's purposely thin because for one, I wanted to see what the underpainting would look like underneath, but I also wanted to build up in the thickness of my gouache. So in the second layers, you might see that my gouache is a little bit thicker because I will start to cover up the line work more. But a lot of this is actually just in the milk consistency. I don't use the gouache very thickly up until the very end, and even then it's not as thick as I would have with my other gouache paintings. So I just put down these colors right here. Usually I would get intimidated, but something about this painting just really made sense to me from the very beginning. I think a lot of it was just really getting to know the medium again and learning how to work with it. There's just a confidence in my process this time that I haven't had with gouache in months. So it was really just a breeze from the start to this painting. I love the entire process, but I think my favorite part might be this very first layer with her hair. A lot of this is still watercolor techniques, and for her hair, it actually remains that way up until the very end. So there's a lot of working with different gradients of color, and there's also a lot of blending towards the edges of her hair, because I really wanted to get the texture of her hair right, because in Solar's post she was talking about the importance of styling natural hair, so that's what I wanted to shine in this painting too. So you can see a lot of these edges, it's just water really. I wanted the watercolors to blossom out towards the edges, just so I can get the softness of her hair right initially. And also so we can contrast that with the very sharp lines that I have for her head accessories, which I will just be painting with thick gouache after. So unlike my usual way that I do gouache, or at least how I've been doing gouache lately, for her face and her skin, I actually went back and forth in consistency. So I started off with very thin gouache, mostly like watercolors, so I can map out her features, like right here. But then for when I got to her skin, I wanted to use thick gouache, and you can see it immediately is a very deep contrast to the very first layer on her skin. But what I will be doing is I will be blending that out on the paper with a clean brush. This is something that I learned from Bianca's landscape class on Skillshare, and I really liked applying that here. But you can see it's a very thick gouache initially that I had for her skin, and then I used a clean brush to soften up those edges and to have those colors blend into each other. With a lot of portrait works, I'm usually scared to paint the skin because usually it's hard to get the blending and the colors right. But for this, I knew immediately where to go with it. It was so fun. At first, and actually for most of this painting, she doesn't look like Solar. It wasn't until the very end stages of the portrait where I sort of sculpted out her face to look like her. For now, what I was focusing on was just putting those colors in there, making sure I have a strong, solid foundation for her skin right before I worry about the accuracy of her features. What I'm doing now is taking a contrasting color to the pale patina, and this is yellow ochre. And I'm just layering that on the background so that there's depth in our background too, but also so it slightly tones down the pale patina, because in my monitor it was starting to look like it was too bright. And so you can see, even though I'm layering it down with warmer colors, I made sure that those colors are very thin so we can still see that beautiful color underneath. So it's just so nice to do this painting. This is the point where I felt like the direction that I was going was more clear. And you can see I'm using the very thick gouache technique again. What I'm doing is just focusing that on the highlights of her skin and her face. So you can see I did put in some very thick gouache on her face, but for most of it where there's shadow, I'm really just using a clean brush to push out the gouache that we put in. So a lot of the shadows on her skin is just those very thin layers of gouache that looks like watercolor. Then that's the look that I would go for the rest of this painting, is that I wanted to show the fluidity of watercolors underneath for the midtones of her skin, and then I would add in some very thick bright gouache just for the highlights, so I'm isolating those from the rest of her skin. And I also like that it shows sort of both looks of gouache, where one side leans more towards watercolors to the other side of gouache, where you can use it to be very thick and very opaque. And you'll see more of that, especially on her chest and her neck, where I left most of it in this very first stage. What I will be adding on to later will just be the parts of her skin that will be hit by the sun. This is also one of the only paintings where I didn't put in a different hue for the skin tone, and I mostly just worked with the browns I have in my palette. The reason for that is the very bright and punchy background, because there's already so much to the background and I wanted there to be contrast between that and her. I wanted to make sure that there's only a few colors on her, and also that they're leaning more towards earth tones. And I also like that because I stayed in those three colors, I think that the burnt sienna just made her look like she was glowing. It's already such a bright color because everything else is just more earthy. I really liked the result of just those three colors. I'm also happy that I didn't overdo it this time, which was again my issue for most of my other gouache paintings. Just a lot of this really went well and also went according to plan, which I just think is rare for me with gouache, and it also just made me so happy and also fall in love with gouache again. For a moment before this, I almost felt very hopeless and I thought that I was gonna have to give up on gouache altogether, but this painting made me feel like I just really need to get to know the medium again, also explore more ways that I could use it. Again, this is my favorite part, is just painting where the highlights are hitting on her skin. And you can see there's that clear separation between that and the first layer. With the first layer, you can even still see the background, but where the highlights are the brightest is the only parts where I put in this thicker gouache. Also just made her skin look like it's glowing more. I liked putting in this bright sienna for the edges so that it adds more to the highlights on her. I'll also bring that over to her makeup because I liked that look so much. But yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of the painting is actually just painting her chest and her collarbones. When it came to drawing in her jewelry, you can see that I started with very thin gouache. This is milk consistency, I think, and I'm just using it to make a guideline before I put in very thick gouache over it. I just wanted to see how the jewelry will look on her and how exactly I was going to place them on her. The accessories was a big part of Solar's post, so I wanted to make sure I don't get any of those wrong. So yeah, just use this very thin gouache for a guideline before I will go over those same colors with thicker gouache so I can finish up those jewelry. After I have all of the elements in the painting basically placed on is only when I went back to her face and made it look more like her. You can see that these are very small adjustments that would just add up to me finally getting her face right. But yeah, this is almost the end of the painting, and this was when I really did with these very small adjustments in, and that's so I can give the same amount of time and attention in the whole piece and not just focus on her face, which is something that I am guilty of doing for most of my paintings. And then before I really get to finish up the painting, I went ahead and added in some texture to the edges of her hair. Because there's going to be a lot of detail and lines to her accessories, I wanted to make sure that her hair doesn't get lost in them. So what I'm doing is just using very thin gouache. This is watercolor consistency, maybe even coffee consistency that I'm working with, but I'm making sure that I'm just focusing them on the outskirts of her hair and not touching the very edge, if that makes sense. I also use that very thin gouache so that this will dry lighter. So you can see the very first ones that we started with, those have dried more natural now, and I really like the texture that I got with that. This part's where I'm working with very thin gouache, and on some of the background is where I applied what I learned from Jane's portrait class. She really uses watercolors so fearlessly, and she also uses a lot of movement in her painting, so I wanted to get that element of painting for this one. And it also made me feel more of the connection between watercolors and gouache, because I just separate those two from each other so much in my head. And I even advise people to do that when they're first starting out with gouache. So it's taken me this long to see those two colors as two sides of the same coin again. And It took me taking those two opposite applications of watercolors and gouache, where Jane uses a lot of movement and fluidity in her watercolors, and then Bianca uses very thick solid lines with her landscape gouache paintings. And that really helped me fall in love with gouache again. And it also helped me approach this painting in a different way than I had been doing for these past few months. And I also think that's why I love the results so much, is because I enjoyed the process a lot. And it also felt like when I was new to gouache and I was just exploring the medium, except this time I have a better idea with how to go about it, and I also know the technicalities of working with the medium more. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this process with me. I hope I wasn't talking too much, but the final parts of this painting will just be me using the gouache to finish up the painting. I will just be layering onto what was already there and cleaning it up, and using gouache at its most opaque for me to finally be able to finish this piece. Thank you guys so much for making it through the end. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me throughout everything. Thank you guys for watching, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.